Welcome everyone to this module that is going to be on low visibility approaches. And of course that means that there are a few different types of approaches to low visibility. In this particular case, what I'm going to do is what would be a typical non-precision approach that will be with a 1 mile visibility or thereabouts. So we'll have some others that'll get down into Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3 conditions, but this particular module is going to be to essentially what's a non-precision approach, instrument approach to low visibility, just breaking out at minimums. This presentation is going to be a PowerPoint at various places and altitudes along the final approach segment from the final approach fix down to minimums. What I'm going to do is follow up with a simulator real-time version, but it'll be in a separate module. I've decided that I want to do is make some of these modules shorter so that they can be interchanged in various ways, but they'll have a shorter span such that I think it'll be a lot easier to be able to learn the information that I'm trying to transmit to you. Now, getting started here, gang, the one thing that I want to point out is a critical condition that you in your normal flying position is not set up for optimum visibility to pick up approach lights on an approach. Seat position is critical. In fact, the Boeing 737 has an optimum seat position indicator that is on the primary flight display and aligned on the top of the yoke. Now, I don't have a presentation of that picture for you. I'll try to get it at another time, but the one thing you have to do is sit forward and be able to look down over the glare shield to pick up lights in these kinds of conditions. And if your normal position is to sit back and sit low, you'll never pick up those lights unless you make an actual attempt to move forward, sit up straight, and look down. Now, if you have a heads-up display is going to force you into the right position. So those of you that are familiar with a heads-up display, you may realize that if you're making an approach using a heads-up display down to minimums, you may even change your seat position for that particular approach, which is a point of emphasis of what I'm trying to make here. Get your seat in the right position to be able to pick up lights. It's a different position than when you are flying under normal visual conditions or conditions where you can pick up the whole runway when you are on the final approach. Another thing to consider is, how current am I or experienced am I in the specific low approach that you'll be making. Recognize there is a difference between a higher minimum to minimum conditions, and the difference between Cat 1, Cat 2, and Cat 3, which all have maybe different calls, different indications that you're looking for, different places you're looking for that information. So ask yourself, how current am I? We'll talk a little bit more about this. And the other part of that I want to review here for you too is the person that I'm flying with. How many approaches have I made under these conditions with the person I'm flying with? Chances are it's going to be somebody you've maybe never flown with before, or have not flown with in a long time, and you never made an approach like this. So keep that in mind, how familiar both of you are as a team to be able to make this approach and make it in a coordinated fashion. And here's the other thing is, recognize whether it's currency of doing this or whether I'm new. Do I have a good understanding and a grasp of how fast things are going to happen below 1,000 feet. And I'm looking ahead, I'm knowing where to look, I'm knowing where to make callouts, because chances are your airline's going to have specific callouts that you will make on this approach. And those callouts, as I've said in a previous module here, make sure that your callouts are not just in a normal voice that you normally speak, but make them good and strong to break through the concentration that is involved in somebody flying low visibility approaches. Here's a strong suggestion that I would make to you. Conduct your own individual review of the details below 1,000 feet. And the reason for that is these types of approaches are not done with any kind of frequency. It may be 6 months since you did the last one. It may be even longer. So there's a certain familiarity that you have when you do things routinely that you don't have on these types of approaches. So that's why this reviewing of details below 1,000 feet are critical. And another thing that I highly recommend is that discuss as a crew when you maybe initially brief the approach before you start an arrival or sometime during the arrival, brief with one another what your indications and calls and crew coordination is going to be during this approach. It's good to have a common understanding of what this approach entails, especially if it has some unique conditions that are associated with it over normal approaches. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, if you're not heads up equipped with your side of the cockpit, remind yourselves of the gradual, safe transition from instrument to visual flight. I've covered that in one other module. I don't know that I've had it up yet, but what is most important in these low visibility approaches, and especially on the side where you have higher minimums that are maybe up in the area of 400, 300, 400, 500 feet, where you're going to break out. This transition is most important because remember, you're not picking up the runway in many of these cases, you're picking up approach lights. And therefore, you don't have a runway, you don't have some of the runway indicator lights to be able to help you with a glide path. And one of the more important things to do is recognize that this should be a gradual transition from once you start to get visual cues to actual visually flying the airplane. So kind of a good rule of thumb is when you break out, take a peek and see things. See what, you know, in your own mind that you are in fact visual, at least with the approach lights. But be 75% instrument flying as you continue the approach and 25% visual. So in and out, but mostly in, flying your instruments. When you get down to maybe 150 feet or so, you know, the runway is going to be a lot clearer in its definition, and go 50% instrument to 50% visual. But in and out, in and out. Don't go entirely visual. But when you get down around what I'm suggesting, somewhere near 100 feet, when you hear that 100-foot call out, you're going to have good definition. Chances are you're going to see the touchdown zone. And then at that point, never give up instrument flying. But once you get down to that 100 feet, be primarily visual, but don't give up cross-checking your instruments until you get really down into that 30-foot area on a call to touchdown. So anyway, here we are on an approach here. We're not at minimums yet. We're not even 100 foot above minimums, but here's an indication of where we're first starting to gain sight of the runway. Notice that these are the approach lights. You don't have any definition of the runway yet, and we're a little over a mile from the end of the runway. So here you are in this condition here, picking up the approach lights. Now, another clarification for a lot of pilots, and it's an area of misunderstanding, your company's going to have guidance on what to do. Make sure that your company guidance is complied with. But we are allowed, regulation-wise, when we pick up approach lights and not the runway environment, we can continue that approach down to 100 feet. Now, I'm going to say that's a general rule, it's a regulation, but various companies may have different sets of circumstance and requirements. But approach lights, even without the runway in sight, allow you to continue the approach in most cases, unless your airline has some restrictions on it. Regulation-wise, you can go down to 100 feet. And 100 feet, you must have the runway environment in sight to be able to continue to land. If you don't have the runway environment in sight at 100 feet, even though you had the approach lights, then that would be an action of a go-around. Now here we've gone down a little bit further. We have good visual on the approach lights. We're still just only the approach lights. We're starting to maybe pick up the end of the runway here, but that's not really clear. So what I want you to understand here, we've gone down a little bit further. Notice we're down into an area that's about a mile from the runway. And here we are in good position to continue that approach. We're on glide path. And what I want to point out here too, this simulator, and some of you I'm sure are flying 737s with dual channel capability on the autopilot. This presentation here is with dual channel. We've got both autopilots engaged. One of the indications here is this flare arm that is part of an auto land system. So I want you to understand, in this case here, we've gone down further. We're now getting to a point where we're approaching minimums. We're a mile from the runway, and we have pretty good resolution. But I want you to notice we have this flare armed. And a single channel aircraft, you'll be in command, but if it's a dual channel capability aircraft, it'll have single channel here at amber, and you won't have this light, this flare light that is shown here. So this could be a difference with your particular airline, whether it's a single channel capable or whether it's dual channel capable. So this is a little distinction that's part of the simulator program that I have. So anyway, that flare arm is getting itself ready to be able to make an auto land, and that's not what we're going to be doing in this case. Now here we are at 100 feet above minimums. Notice we're still on a descent here. Here's our minimums, and we're still above it. So at this point here, everything is still looking good. We're on glide path. I have the approach lights. I have the red bars on the approach lights. And I'm starting to pick up the runway environment itself, which is this end green line here. I can see the VASIs, and I can see the touchdown zone. So we're in good position to continue this approach to landing. However, I put this if in here. With visibilities on approaches, you must be able to maintain that runway for this last 100 or 200 feet. And I'll tell you, I've seen conditions before where you picked up the runway environment at this altitude, and as you continue, you lose it. Recognize that when you're dealing with low visibilities and fog and such like that, it's different in different areas. And so you may right now have good visual conditions, but you may get closer and all of a sudden you're going to lose a runway. I have seen that a couple times. So, be ready to go around if you have to at any time until you make a touchdown. Now, in most cases here, another thing that I want to cover on non-precision approaches is that when you get to minimums, and this is on non-precision approaches, again, your airline's going to have certain criteria for how you operate with the autopilot. And in this case here, we're not going to be making an auto land. We wouldn't be making an auto land here unless it was a pilot option to do so, even in these conditions. But the point is this, gang, is that most airlines would have a requirement that you will disconnect the autopilot at minimums, and fly manually. And here is where these transitions are important of instrument, visual, visual, instrument. So I want to continue on with this. Here we are at minimums. Great clarity on the touchdown zone lighting, the end of the runway. This shows on the VASIs we're a little bit high, but it shows on the glide slope here that we're right on. And we're right here, about 100 feet above the runway. And we'll go ahead and make sure that the autopilot is disconnected if your requirements are to disconnect that autopilot, and then transition to that instrument and visual condition that we talked about. Now from here, we're already at 100 feet. At this point here, I would be recommending that you fly 75% visual because you've got good clarity here to be able to do that. You should have the airplane pretty well trimmed up to be able to maintain that glide path. However, remember, crosswinds. Notice here we've got a pretty good crosswind that we have here. I want to continue to fly these instruments to handle a crosswind and to handle a glide slope that is going to be accurate to get me in the touchdown zone area. So that is most critical when you're making the final part of this approach. That transition from 75% instrument, 25% visual, 50-50, and around 100 feet is a good place where you can maybe start to think about 75% visual, 25% instrument. Never give up instrument. Never give it up entirely until you touch down. All right, as we conclude this, gang, the one thing that I want to re-emphasize, and I hope this was helpful to at least do one aspect of a visual low approach. And as I said before, we're going to do a Cat 1s, Cat 2s, Cat 3s, and you'll see the visual conditions under those circumstances as well. But one thing I want to again re-emphasize, this is an area that has always been a real education of sorts by experience, and it happens so often in training, even with experienced people. If you don't have a heads-up display, which solves the whole problem, you put the pipper in the circle, and that's going to take you right down to a touchdown area. And when you have those, you can have great clarity as you go through the opaqueness, continue the approach, and pick up the visual cues. You're always going to be right on localizer, right on glide path. But where you don't have heads-up display, if you start to go visual when you break out, I'll tell you some real exciting things kind of happen at that point. And in many cases, you may lose the approach. So again, this transition that I discussed with you is critically important. And when I say that, that's my foot I'm stomping. Stay with instruments with a good part of that transition from instrument to visual until you get down around 100 feet. So I hope this is helpful. I think it should be the kind of thing that will help you in training, but what's even more important is when you're carrying a little old lady from Pasadena, this transition is really important for safety and for a good result at the end of your trip.